So chapter 9 is going to deal with the catabolic process of taking glucose and turning it into energy. And we do this using a process called cellular respiration. So all of our cells require energy to do work. Remember that energy is the capacity to do work. So the whole point of cellular respiration is to generate this energy. So we're going to generate this in the form of ATP. The energy starts stored in organic molecules. So it's going to start as potential energy in organic molecules, things like sugars. And through the process of cellular respiration, which is going to be many, many steps, we're going to eventually generate approximately 32 ATP molecules. So again, this is catabolic. We are breaking down organic molecules, which is an exergonic process. So this is going to release energy from those chemical reactions. When you think of the word respiration, what do you think of? If you think of respiration, you're probably thinking of breathing. So oxygen comes in, carbon dioxide comes out. And that's correct. So that's pulmonary respiration. We're going to talk about what happens to the oxygen and the carbon dioxide at the cellular level. This word aerobic means with oxygen. So aerobic respiration is when organic molecules are going to be consumed. So our body's going to break down some kind of organic molecule like a sugar, and oxygen is consumed. So it's going to require oxygen, and it's going to yield ATP. Anaerobic, so AN, when I add that to a word, means without. So anaerobic means without oxygen. So this is respiration. It's very similar. So it's going to consume compounds, but it's typically not going to use oxygen. A lot of times anaerobic respiration will consume something like sulfur instead of oxygen. This is common in organisms that live in oxygen deficient areas or really, really deep in the ocean near like hydrothermal vents. Fermentation is not a complete breakdown. So in aerobic and anaerobic, the organic components were consumed. That means that they were completely broken down into their components. Fermentation is a partial degradation. So that means that the sugars that we put into fermentation are only broken down a little bit, not completely. And this again is going to occur without. So there's no oxygen. The processes we're going to focus on here are cellular respiration first, and then we'll talk about fermentation at the end. So cellular respiration is our body's process of taking sugar and turning it into energy. There are aerobic and anaerobic steps. So the very first step is glycolysis, and this step does not require oxygen. So because it does not need oxygen, we consider it anaerobic. After that, we're going to have the citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. So the last two steps are both going to be aerobic because they're going to require oxygen. So cellular respiration is a mix of both anaerobic and aerobic. We usually just refer to it as aerobic because you can't do the whole thing without oxygen. You can only do the first step. So typically cellular respiration is often exchangeable or interchangeable with the word aerobic respiration. So down here we have a chemical formula, and I want you to think about the things that your body needs. What do you use for fuel for your body? How do you get energy into your body? You eat food. So one of the components of getting energy is the food that we eat. So this is glucose. So we're going to go through this whole process with glucose, and then we'll show you at the end how this can be different with proteins and lipids. We're talking about respiration, so that's breathing. So what gas do you breathe into your body? You breathe oxygen. So the two reactants required for cellular respiration are our organic molecule, which is our sugar, and our gas, oxygen. We'll have several steps to this reaction. So this arrow is going to be glycolysis, citric acid cycle, oxidative phosphorylation. At the end of all of these processes, we will release some byproducts. So one of the waste products that we release is carbon dioxide. And your body gets rid of this by exhaling it from your lungs. You're also going to make some water. This is not very much water, so we call this metabolic water. You might make about 400 grams of metabolic water in a day. Again, this is not enough to hydrate you. And the main goal of this is to create energy. So we'll create energy in the form of ATP, which is usable. And every step, according to the second law of thermodynamics, will also create heat that will just get lost to the atmosphere and won't be usable. You need to know this overall formula for cellular respiration. So you need to know that glucose and oxygen are the reactants, carbon dioxide, water, and ATP are the products. So as we go through this large metabolic pathway, we're going to see several redox reactions. So redox is a combination of two words, reduction, oxidation. So reduction and oxidation happen when we transfer electrons. Every time we move electrons, it's going to change the potential energy. So this is how we're going to get energy out of our reactants, is by moving electrons around. Oxidation occurs when you lose an electron. Reduction occurs when a substance gains an electron. So hopefully you can see how these are linked. If one substance loses an electron, it's oxidized. The substance that gains the electron is reduced. So you can't have oxidation without reduction. They're always going to come hand in hand. So we just shorten this to redox. So we might have two chemicals, so chemical A and reactant B. And what's going to happen is maybe an electron is going to be transferred from one to the other. Chemical A, who loses the electron, becomes oxidized. And chemical B, who gains the electron, becomes reduced. So we'll end up with A with a positive charge and B with a negative charge. There are some silly ways to remember this. One of them is Leo, the lion, says grr. When you lose an electron, you are oxidized, Leo. When you gain an electron, you are reduced, grr. The electron donor, so in this case, A is the electron donor because it had the electron and it gave it up, is called the reducing agent because A reduced B. The electron receptor, so this in case, the B is the electron receptor because it receives an electron, is the oxidizing agent because it oxidized A. I want you to focus on knowing what oxidation and reduction mean. So here's an example. We have sodium and chlorine, and these are going to come together to form sodium chloride or salt. So what happens is sodium is going to give an electron to chlorine, and it's going to form an ionic bond. So in this case, remember Leo, sodium loses an electron, so sodium becomes oxidized. Chlorine gains the electron, remember Gur. Chlorine gains the electron, so chlorine is going to become reduced. This is pretty clear to see when you have charged particles at the end. When we lose an electron, we get a positive charge. When we gain an electron, we get a negative charge. And so you can kind of tell who lost and who gained the electron. And so in a simple equation like sodium chloride, it's a little easier to figure out who got oxidized and who got reduced. When we look at the actual equation for cellular respiration, we don't see any overall charges. So we need to think about how the electrons are shared. We're going to start with the sugar, and the carbons in the sugar are going to get transformed into carbon in carbon dioxide. So we're going to look at the carbons in these two molecules. So in glucose, carbon is typically going to be sharing with hydrogen. We know that carbon and hydrogen have about the same electronegativity. This is going to be a non-polar covalent bond. And these electrons are going to be shared pretty much right in the center, equally between them. So they both have equal access to those electrons. When this process occurs, so from reactant to product, the carbons are going to go from sharing with hydrogen to now sharing with oxygen. Well, this is now a polar bond. Carbon is not anywhere near as electronegative as oxygen, so the electrons are going to be over here a lot closer to oxygen. So what happened to the carbon? The carbon went from having equal access to electrons to less access to electrons. So it essentially loses electrons. We can do the same thing looking at oxygen from the reactants to the products. So the oxygen that you breathe in actually gets turned into water. So oxygen starts out as oxygen sharing with oxygen, which this is again non-polar because oxygen and oxygen have the same electronegativity. So the electrons are going to be pretty much right in the middle, shared equally between these two molecules. When oxygen gets turned into water, now we've got oxygen sharing with hydrogen, and we know that this is a polar bond. Oxygen is much stronger, so the electrons in this pairing are going to be much closer to the oxygen. So the oxygen goes from having 50-50 equal access to electrons to actually getting more access to electrons. So essentially it is gaining access to electrons. It doesn't pull them completely away from hydrogen, but it does get to hang on to them a little tighter. So the oxygen is actually reduced from oxygen to water. So as we've seen many times now, when we do biological pathways and processes, we do lots of little steps and we pull energy out at every single little step. We're going to see that we have a very stepwise energy harvest. Sometimes the energy molecule is going to be really obvious and we're just going to generate ATP and you're going to know what that is. A lot of the steps in these pathways are going to create an energy transport molecule called NADH. So what happens is NAD+ is given some hydrogens plus the electrons that are associated with hydrogen, and it is reduced to NADH. So anytime that we move hydrogens around, we're also moving the associated electron around. So in this case, when we give NAD+ access to a hydrogen and an electron, it is gaining an electron and therefore it is reduced to NADH. NADH is a high energy molecule and it will store the energy for a temporary period of time, and then eventually the energy that is stored in here will go on to be made into ATP later on in the process at the electron transport chain. So you're going to see in the very first two steps, glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, we don't make a lot of ATP. We're going to make some, but we're going to make a lot of these energy molecules, NADH. And then there's another one that's similar called FADH2, which we'll make some of. In the very last step of cellular respiration, we're going to reach something called the electron transport chain. And it's literally very small steps down a pathway of electrons. And at every little step, we're going to be able to generate some ATP from the NADH. So the NADH will come in and donate hydrogens and electrons, and then we'll be able to harvest the energy from there. The molecule powering this process is oxygen. Oxygen's over here at the very end, and oxygen is very electronegative. So think about this as an electron magnet, and it is pulling these electrons down the electron transport chain. So we actually aren't going to be able to harvest any ATP without having oxygen present. And that is the whole reason that you have to breathe oxygen, is to power the electron transport chain. So in the next several videos, we're going to go through each of these processes in detail, and I will highlight exactly what you need to know about each of them. So the very first step is going to be glycolysis, and it is going to take glucose and break it down into 2 molecules of pyruvate. So glucose has 6 carbons. We're going to break these each down into 3 carbon molecules. This does not require oxygen. The second step is the citric acid cycle, which is going to take those pyruvate molecules and completely break them down into carbon dioxide. This one does require oxygen. And then oxidative phosphorylation, which is going to include the electron transport chain. And this, of course, does require oxygen. So we're going to make very little ATP in steps 1 and 2, and then the vast majority of ATP in step number 3. So as we go, we're going to track the number of ATP that are generated throughout these processes. So oxidative phosphorylation, that's that last step, is going to make the vast majority, about 90%. By the end, I will promise you, we will make 32 ATPs from each molecule of glucose. ATP is generated in a process called phosphorylation. If you think about that, we're literally taking ADP and adding a phosphate to it, so that's phosphorylating, to turn it into ATP. Sometimes we do this at the substrate level, where I literally pluck a phosphate off of something, stick it on an ADP, and turn it into ATP. This is going to be a very simple way to make ATP. We do this in the first glycolysis and citric acid cycle. The electron transport chain is not going to generate ATP in the same manner. It's going to use oxidative phosphorylation, which is going to require oxygen to pull electrons down the electron transport chain and then create a hydrogen concentration gradient and then pull the hydrogen through another protein to create ATP. So it's a much more complex method of making ATP.